The Japanese pilots believed the night sky was their shield. Cloaked in darkness, they felt untouchable, convinced that American planes would never dare to follow them into the void. For years, the silence of midnight patrols gave them comfort, a promise that when the sun went down, their lives were safe. But then, something changed. From the blackness of the Pacific heavens came a sound unlike anything they had heard before. Engines roared where none should be. Gunfire ripped through the still night air. Out of the shadows, America's night fighters emerged, deadly predators equipped with secret radar that could pierce the dark. In an instant, the hunter became the hunted. The Japanese pilots looked around, but the enemy was invisible until it was far too late. The night was no longer theirs, it had become their grave. For centuries, darkness had been the ultimate protection in war. Armies rested under the cover of night, and pilots believed the stars and shadows would guard them from sudden death. In the Pacific theater of World War II, Japanese aviators carried this same belief. To them, night missions were a time to regroup, refuel, and fly without fear. They were confident that American technology and training could never master the art of fighting in total darkness. But America had been preparing in silence. Engineers and tacticians were working on a weapon unlike any the Japanese had ever seen, radar-guided night fighters. These aircraft could see in the black void, hunting without lights, tracking enemies who thought themselves safe. When these planes finally entered the war, they shattered one of Japan's strongest illusions. The night was no longer neutral ground. It became a hunting ground, and the Japanese pilots who once trusted the shadows soon discovered that the darkness now belonged to the Americans. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots carried themselves with a certain invincibility. They had swept across Asia and the Pacific, their Zero fighters dominating skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. But beyond their skill and their machines, there was something else they relied upon, a belief that the night itself was their ally. For Japanese airmen, night flying was more than a tactic, it was a shield. They had grown accustomed to the idea that American aircraft, limited by outdated instruments and a lack of training, could not possibly challenge them once the sun had fallen. After sunset, Japanese squadrons could transfer bases, fly reconnaissance, and even prepare ambushes of their own without fear of interception. Their confidence was so high that some pilots wrote home describing the night skies as a sanctuary where no enemy dares to enter. This mindset was rooted in both tradition and experience. Japan's naval air doctrine emphasized boldness and initiative, and pilots were encouraged to exploit every advantage they could find. Night operations were considered a daring extension of this spirit. The Zero, though not equipped with advanced night fighting instruments, was agile enough to make pilots feel secure even in dim starlight. American airmen in the early months reinforced this illusion. Many U.S. squadrons avoided night patrols entirely, lacking both the technology and the training to risk flying blind. Japanese pilots observed this hesitation and mistook it for weakness. They believed they had discovered a safe haven in the darkness, a space where their supremacy would go unchallenged. This confidence extended into their culture as well. Japanese wartime propaganda painted their pilots as warriors in harmony with the natural world. Just as samurai once fought beneath the moon, so too did aviators of the Imperial Navy find strength in the night. Newspapers glorified tales of daring nighttime flights, portraying their airmen as untouchable shadows. Yet beneath the pride, there was also complacency. Japanese air forces did not invest heavily in specialized night fighting technology. Radar, a field still in its infancy, was not developed with urgency in Tokyo. Training for blind flying, navigating without visual cues, was minimal compared to European standards. To Japanese commanders, such investments seemed unnecessary. Why prepare for a threat they believed would never come? This overconfidence created a fatal gap. While Japanese pilots saw the night as their fortress, American scientists and strategists were quietly turning it into a trap. By clinging to old traditions and assumptions, the Japanese left themselves exposed to a revolution in aerial warfare they never anticipated. The irony was brutal. The very skies that once gave them comfort would soon betray them. What they thought was sanctuary would become a killing ground. And when America's night fighters finally entered the scene, the Japanese pilots would realize too late that the darkness they trusted had already been claimed by their enemy. While Japanese pilots enjoyed their illusion of safety in the dark, American engineers and commanders were working on a radical solution that would shatter it. In Washington and its secret bases across the U.S., a quiet revolution was underway. The United States was determined to claim the night skies, and to do that, they would need a weapon unlike anything Japan, or even Germany, had faced in the Pacific. The key lay in radar. Developed in the years leading up to the war, radar had already proven its worth during the Battle of Britain, where the British used it to detect incoming Luftwaffe raids. But using radar not just to track enemy bombers, but to hunt them down in the pitch black of night, required a leap of innovation. American engineers took on that challenge. The result was the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the first U.S. aircraft designed from the ground up as a night fighter. It was a beast compared to the nimble Japanese Zero, twin engines, heavy armament, and, most importantly, an advanced radar system mounted in its nose. With a three-man crew consisting of a pilot, gunner, and radar operator, the P-61 was a flying hunter, capable of detecting enemy aircraft miles away in total darkness. Secrecy was paramount. Early tests were conducted far from prying eyes, as the military sought to keep this new weapon hidden until it was ready. Pilots who trained on the Black Widow were given strict orders never to discuss their missions outside their units. Even within the U.S. military, only a handful of officers truly understood the capabilities of this new machine. But it wasn't only about the aircraft, it was about the men who flew them. Night fighting required an entirely different kind of pilot. Flying without visual references, relying solely on instruments and the voice of a radar operator, demanded immense trust and discipline. These pilots had to train for situations where a mistake could mean death in an instant. They practiced in total blackouts, flying long hours with no lights, learning to stalk a target that only appeared as a green blip on a screen. The first squadrons equipped with night fighters were dispatched to both the European and Pacific theaters. In Europe, they tangled with German bombers and learned valuable lessons about night interceptions. In the Pacific, however, their task was different. They were to hunt Japanese aircraft that believed they ruled the darkness. When the Black Widows finally arrived in the Pacific in 1944, Japanese intelligence was caught off guard. Reports of large, unfamiliar American aircraft operating at night began trickling in, but commanders dismissed them as exaggerations. To the Japanese high command, the idea that Americans could challenge their night supremacy seemed absurd. Meanwhile, U.S. squadrons quietly prepared their ambushes. They coordinated with radar stations on the ground, which could track Japanese planes as they took off or returned from missions. Once spotted, the information was relayed to night fighters already prowling the skies. The radar operator guided the pilot closer and closer until, often within 1,000 feet, the Japanese pilot suddenly realized he was not alone. The first successful interceptions shocked both sides. Japanese aviators, who thought themselves untouchable, suddenly found tracers ripping through their wings and engines exploding around them. For the Americans, it was proof that years of secret development and training had paid off. They had not just built a new weapon, they had changed the rules of the air war. What made these ambushes so effective was not simply the technology, but the element of surprise. The Japanese were flying blind, while the Americans could see them in the dark. To those on the receiving end, it must have felt as if the night itself had turned against them, betraying them to an invisible enemy. By mid-1944, the U.S. had fully committed to this new form of warfare. Squadrons of Black Widows and other radar-equipped aircraft began to spread across the Pacific Islands, following the American advance toward Japan. The Japanese still believed in the safety of darkness, but now, every flight they took at night carried the risk of unseen death waiting in the clouds. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese pilots still believed in the safety of the night sky. Their confidence was about to be shattered forever. Across the Pacific, American night fighter squadrons had completed their training and were now lying in wait. The moment had come to test whether the theories, the radar screens, and the months of practice could deliver victory when it mattered most. The first encounters were sudden and terrifying. A Japanese bomber, returning from a raid on Allied positions, cruised home in the cool night air, its crew relaxed, believing they were invisible. For hours, they had seen nothing but the endless stars and the Black Sea below. But unknown to them, a P-61 Black Widow was stalking them. Guided by its radar operator, the American plane closed the distance. At less than a mile, the bomber's crew finally caught a glimpse, tracers cutting through the night, engines erupting in flames. In seconds, their safe passage dissolved into a fiery descent. Word of these attacks spread quickly. At first, Japanese air commanders dismissed the losses as accidents, mechanical failure, disorientation, perhaps even bad luck. But soon the pattern was undeniable. Bombers and fighters flying at night were not simply vanishing into storms, they were being hunted. And the hunters were unseen until it was too late. The Black Widow was not the only predator in the night. Modified Hellcats and Corsairs, equipped with radar pods and flown by specially trained pilots, also began intercepting Japanese aircraft. These fighters had less range than the P-61 but were faster and could operate from aircraft carriers, extending the reach of America's night fighting capability deep into Japanese territory. For the Japanese pilots, the first sign of danger was often the flash of gunfire ripping into their wings. Some tried evasive maneuvers, but the Americans had already perfected the art of closing silently from behind. A single burst of cannon fire could rip a Zero apart before the Japanese pilot even understood what was happening. Survivors spoke of panic in the cockpit, the eerie sensation of being stalked by an enemy they could not see. One account describes a Japanese reconnaissance pilot who barely escaped. Flying over the Marianas, he suddenly felt his plane shudder as bullets tore through its fuselage. He banked hard, diving through clouds, convinced he had escaped. But moments later, the Black Widow reappeared behind him, relentless and unseen until the final instant. He managed to crash land, shaken and terrified. When interrogated later by his own superiors, he could only describe it as being hunted by a ghost. The Americans, meanwhile, were honing their tactics with every engagement. Radar operators developed a rhythm, calmly guiding pilots into position while gunners waited for the order to fire. Many missions ended without the Japanese even knowing they had been followed for miles. These interceptions became so precise that crews referred to them as silent assassinations. As losses mounted, Japanese commanders began to grow alarmed. They had underestimated America's technological edge, and now their men were paying the price. Pilots who once bragged about night flights began requesting daylight missions instead. The sense of invulnerability that had once filled their squadrons was eroding with every ambush. The psychological effect was immense. For years, Japanese pilots had believed that the night sky was their sanctuary, a place where no enemy dared to enter. Now, that belief was crumbling. Each new mission carried a shadow of fear. Would tonight be the night they were hunted down? Would the darkness that once sheltered them now swallow them whole? By late 1944, the pattern was clear: the Americans owned the night. Japanese losses after sunset grew so severe that their air operations began to shrink. Missions once considered routine became deadly gambles. The ambushes had worked, not just in destroying aircraft, but in breaking the spirit of the men who flew them. The Pacific night, once a shield, had become a battlefield. And the Japanese pilots, once predators, were now prey. When the first whispers of American night fighters began circulating through Japanese air bases, many pilots dismissed them as rumors. They laughed at the idea of Americans flying blind through darkness, hunting without the light of the moon. But as more aircraft failed to return from missions, as more comrades vanished into the night, laughter gave way to unease. And unease soon hardened into fear. For Japanese pilots, the night had been a trusted companion. It had sheltered them from the dangers of daytime dogfights, where American fighters swarmed the skies. Now, that sanctuary had been ripped away. Letters recovered after the war reveal the growing dread. One pilot wrote to his family, "The darkness used to comfort me. Now I wonder if every shadow hides death." Another described the night sky as a pit of unseen demons. The effect on morale was devastating. Squadrons that once volunteered eagerly for night missions began stalling, making excuses, or flying with trembling hands on their controls. Reports from Japanese commanders complained of nervousness, hesitation, and even refusal to obey orders. The idea that the Americans had found a way to see in the dark struck at the very core of their warrior spirit. Superstition spread like wildfire. In a culture steeped in tradition and honor, unexplained events often took on mystical meaning. Some pilots began to believe that the Americans had harnessed spirits, that the ghost planes stalking them at night were unnatural. Rumors of phantom fighters, capable of striking from nowhere, filled the barracks. Others believed the Black Widow's silhouette, with its long wings and twin tails, resembled a demon descending from the heavens. This fear bled into combat performance. Once confident in their Zero fighters, Japanese aviators now second-guessed every movement. At the first hint of gunfire, panic often took hold. Instead of fighting back, they broke formation and dove wildly, making themselves even easier targets. American pilots reported engagements where the enemy seemed paralyzed, unable to mount an effective defense. The psychological toll was not confined to the pilots alone. Ground crews, too, felt the weight of despair. Watching squadrons depart under the cover of night, many wondered how many would ever return. Each empty bunk in the barracks was a reminder that darkness no longer offered safety. Even Japanese civilians began to sense the shift. Once reassured that their pilots could operate freely after sunset, they now listened to stories of fiery crashes and broken wings falling from the stars. For a nation already stretched thin by war, this erosion of confidence was catastrophic. The Japanese air service thrived on the image of fearless warriors, men who would gladly give their lives for the emperor. Yet the night ambushes revealed a vulnerability that propaganda could not conceal. When even the bravest pilots feared the darkness, the myth of Japanese invincibility cracked. The Americans understood this psychological edge. For every Japanese plane destroyed, dozens more were haunted by the thought that they might be next. It was not just about the kill count, it was about sowing doubt, breaking nerves, and ensuring that Japanese aviators no longer trusted the very skies they once claimed as their own. By late 1944, the transformation was complete. The night, once their shield, had become their tormentor. Japanese pilots strapped into their cockpits with dread, knowing that every flight could end with unseen tracers tearing their wings apart. Fear had replaced confidence, and shadows that once comforted them now whispered of death. The arrival of America's night fighters did more than just frighten Japanese pilots, it changed the balance of power in the skies. For the first time, the Japanese could no longer count on the safety of darkness. Every hour of the day, from sunrise to the deepest midnight, the skies above the Pacific were contested. The war had become a 24-hour struggle, and the Japanese were losing ground. Strategically, the impact was enormous. Before the introduction of radar-equipped fighters, Japanese bombers could launch night raids against American bases, ships, and supply lines with minimal risk. These operations were designed to harass and disrupt, forcing U.S. forces to remain constantly alert. But with the arrival of the Black Widow and its companions, those raids turned suicidal. Suddenly, Japanese bombers were being intercepted before they even reached their targets. Convoys that once sailed nervously under moonlight now had cover from above. The Americans quickly realized the advantage they had gained. Night fighter squadrons were deployed to key bases across the Pacific Islands, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, and the Philippines. Their presence meant that no matter where Japanese aircraft attempted to fly, the threat of interception loomed. Radar stations on the ground worked hand in hand with airborne fighters, creating a seamless shield of detection and response. The Japanese could no longer predict when or where the ambush would strike. This new reality forced a change in Japanese tactics. Missions that once seemed routine were now avoided. Bombing runs shifted back to daylight hours, where Japanese fighters could at least see their enemy, though this exposed them to overwhelming American air superiority. It was a cruel dilemma: face swarms of daylight fighters, or risk the invisible hunters of the night. Either way, losses mounted. The effectiveness of America's night fighters extended beyond combat results. They gave U.S. commanders a psychological weapon. Every Japanese pilot knew that darkness was no longer a shield but a trap. This uncertainty drained morale, while boosting the confidence of American crews. No longer did U.S. forces dread the fall of night, they embraced it, knowing their machines and training gave them the edge. The turning point was not just tactical, but symbolic. The Pacific War had always been as much about spirit as it was about strategy. Japanese propaganda celebrated the bravery and skill of its aviators, portraying them as masters of both day and night. But the sudden dominance of American night fighters tore that myth apart. When Japanese pilots themselves no longer believed in their supremacy, the illusion crumbled. Even at the highest levels of Japanese command, the frustration was evident. Reports described generals demanding answers as to why their planes kept disappearing. But there was no solution. Japan lacked the resources to develop radar-equipped fighters of its own on a large scale, and time was running out. With every month, the Americans pressed closer to the Japanese home islands, and their night fighters flew ever deeper into enemy skies. By 1945, the outcome was clear. The Japanese Air Force was exhausted, its pilots weary and fearful, its tactics outdated. America's mastery of the night had become one of the many factors accelerating Japan's collapse. The skies were no longer shared, they belonged to the Allies, around the clock. What began as a secret experiment had become a decisive shift in the Pacific War. The darkness itself, once an ally of Japan, had turned against them. And with that shift, the countdown to their defeat had accelerated. In the end, the story of America's night fighters was not only about machines and tactics, it was about the collapse of certainty. For Japanese pilots, the night had once been their refuge, a place where they believed courage and tradition would shield them from danger. That belief was shattered when radar-guided fighters pierced the veil of darkness and revealed that no sanctuary was beyond reach. For the Americans, the night fighters became a symbol of adaptation. They represented the willingness to embrace new technology, to train in ways that seemed impossible, and to strike when the enemy least expected it. The Black Widow and its crews proved that innovation could transform the battlefield, turning fear into advantage and uncertainty into victory. The legacy of these battles still echoes through modern warfare. Today's air forces rely on technology to dominate the skies at all hours, an inheritance of the lessons learned in the Pacific. But for the Japanese pilots of World War II, those lessons came at a terrible price. What they once called safety became their grave, and the night itself, once their ally, was claimed forever by the enemy.